Hello and welcome to this first introductory podcast. I'm spiritual medium Shannon and this is Spiritual Sharing. For those of you who would be interested in checking out a little bit more of my socials, you can do so by heading to Instagram or YouTube and following Spiritual Medium Shannon. Or you can head over to my website where I will provide a link for that in the description sections of this podcast. With all of that said, what you can expect from this very new, very raw podcast, Spiritual Sharing, is just that. This will be a place where I will share a lot of my spiritual knowledge, my spiritual journey, what I'm currently learning, my experiences. With all that said, I hope you enjoy Spiritual Sharing with me, Spiritual Medium Shannon. Hi, and thank you again for returning to my podcast. For today's episode, I thought I would do a little bit of a talk about how I know when spirit's around and how I see spirit, quote unquote, see spirit. I did mention this in the first podcast upload, the episode prior to this one, and this was a big part of my childhood, and in the last 3 years having my spiritual side resurfacing and being aware of spirit energy being within my home, within my physical space. And I guess I thought that this would be a good place to start in discussing how that happens. For a long time, I thought seeing, hearing, all the clairs associated with spirit was exactly how it's perceived in the movies and how wrong I was. Basically, get rid of most of that. There's very few films that will depict spiritual connection in its accuracy. Basically, when I say seeing, while when the lady, and if you don't know, you should probably go and listen to the previous podcast here, but when I was living in the home before this one and becoming a bit more spiritually aware, there was a spirit associated with the home that I was living in, and I did experience being woken up by her in the middle of the night. In the moment, it's very real, and you do think that there's a physical manifested form in front of you. For the initial wake up, that was the case, and I'm going to say that's very rare, very rare for me and very rare for a lot of people to experience that. Now, that's not the case for everybody. There are mediums, there are psychics, there are those that work with spirit who do see manifestation on the regular, and potentially welcome that and are open to that. For somebody like me who doesn't see and experience physical manifestation on the regular, that was very confronting. So the initial wake up where she was in front of me, that was very much physical manifestation. Seeing her at the end of my bed, very much physical manifestation. And that's the only time, apart from once when I was a child, which I do believe was physical manifestation. But that being said, I was a child, so, child's imagination, it may not have been the case. But in the experience of the lady at that home, that was very real, that was very physical. Aside from that, it doesn't work like that for me. There's not many instances, well, there hasn't been besides those two that I've mentioned, where the manifestation is physical. And from what I can gather, for many that's the case. How spirit comes forward, it's all in the mind and in the mind's eye. And if you've heard about the mind's eye, that's that spot sort of between your eyebrow, a little bit higher up. Sort of when you close your eyes, your visual will sort of rest here, if that makes sense. So for the large part, for the most part, that's how I see spirit. So it's not a physical form, it's the sensation of not being alone. When you sort of get that sensation of being watched or someone's looking at you, that's the energy shift that lets me know that there is a spirit or spirit around me. And then the visual aspect does come through the mind's eye, and that's why it can be really hard to accept that what you're seeing is real, because your ego, your imagination sort of intertwine into each other, and it can be very hard to sort of switch one off and accept the other, if that makes sense. So for me, a big part about realizing that I am able to communicate with spirit was accepting how spirit is presented to me and how I see, quote unquote, see spirit. And it's very much not how I thought it was, because you may hear many in the spiritual world mention seeing, hearing, feeling, and all the other sort of ings, all the other clairs that go along. And when I was becoming more aware of the fact that this is definitely something that I'm experiencing, it did take me a little bit of time to sort of accept that, you know, I'd watch or I'd read or I'd be listening to or talking to people who connect with spirit, and they would say, you know, pay attention to when you see spirit, pay attention to when you feel spirit, pay attention to when you hear spirit. And I thought I was doing that, but I was anticipating physical visual, I was anticipating physical touch, I was anticipating you know, loud resounding voice, loud resounding external voice, and it doesn't work like that, at least not for me. How I hear spirit, it's very much within my own mind, within my third eye, and the voice is often my own. It's not always, although it has begun to be. Now, the more that I do readings and the more that I am listening, the voice does come through. If I am hearing, it does sometimes come through now where it's not my voice, but a lot of the time it is. It's just recognizing when that voice isn't my own, in a sense that it will sound like my own, but in the process of doing the reading, in the process of being in that meditative state, to be open to hearing, it comes in out of nowhere. It's not my own thought process that has interjected the word, the sound, etc. The same goes for seeing. It's sort of, and this was the hardest part for me, really, to try to discern what was my own thought and what is spiritual messages, or spirit itself. And once I sort of got over trying to figure everything out and just trusting that when I allow myself to be open to receiving messages, that whatever comes in that moment is from spirit, and it's still a process that I do, or I am learning to understand, but it is a process that I've definitely accepted. I don't doubt it as much as I used to, and that has allowed me to give really accurate and positive readings to those who I'm working with. So while sight is a large part of the process, it's for me probably the main part of the process at the moment. It isn't as physical a form or as physical a format as I went into this process thinking it would be. And I did find that once I realized that, the process definitely became much more easy, and the messages that came forward were delivered a lot more clear than they had been before, when I would be anticipating perhaps more than what it was that I was seeing. I hope that makes enough sense for you. And again, if there's any questions involving any of this, I'm more than happy to answer them. Another thing that I've learned is that, while it is a gift that I have opened enough and developed enough to be able to do this, it's not a special gift that only so many can do. Everybody is available to expand and experience and understand and learn and be able to connect with spirit. It's just I guess some may have been more aware and more able to do so from a younger age. And a lot of the times you'll find that, third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation, psychics or mediums, etc., are able to do so from such a young age because of their upbringing. They've got others in their family that are able to teach them how to do it, understand how to do it, and then it just develops from there. And you'll find that their gift is very strong because they've had that positive gearing, that positive experience with spirit from such a young age. Whereas for others, myself included, it takes a little bit longer to be able to grasp that you can do this. And the second that you realize you can, the second that you understand how to go about it, the easier and the quicker your spiritual journey will begin. If that's the area in which you wish to go, wish. What am I saying? Wish to go. I don't know. Anyway. So the other area that I wanted to focus on here was touch. Again, it isn't, as I've mentioned, a physical touch. It is a physical sensation, but it's not the same as if you go up to somebody and touch them. If somebody comes up to you and touches you on your arm, it doesn't necessarily feel the same as that. It may be the case for some. For myself, it isn't like that at all. But it is, I do feel a sensation. The sensation can vary, but like just last night or the night before, one of my grandparents passed away back in December, and I've been waiting for her to come forward, and she has a couple of times, but she's just sort of present. There's not a lot to say. Anyway, she came to me the other night and placed her hand on my arm, and I felt the sensation before I realised it was her there, and there was just a tingling, like goosebumps, or like when you've, what is that called? When you, what is that called? When you sit a funny way, pins and needles, that's it. When you get pins and needles, I don't know if that's what you know it as, but sort of when you sit funny on your foot, or you sit funny, you're resting too long in the one spot, and then when you move you get that sort of tingling sensation. Not as strong as when you do it for a long time and then you pull your arm down and you can barely move your arm because it's tingling so much, or your foot, you can't walk for 20 minutes until the tingling stops. It's not that intense, but it is like a goosebumpy pins and needle type feeling, and that's how I experience touch. There's not many times, I know for some psychics and mediums, when they do a reading, if there's a health issue, they may feel it or sense it in some particular way. I'm still sort of learning with that one. It's not been as clear as when I experienced that sensation of physical touch. There has been times where it has come up for me in a reading where I will sort of, get a bit of a tightness in my chest, but it's very subtle at the moment. And I mean, I don't want it to be too strong, but I think because that's how I've set it up to be that way, I'm still sort of learning with that aspect. But again, basically the overall gist of this episode was to sort of remove the standard perception of spiritual sight, spiritual touch, spiritual hearing, those and spiritual sight, from how your mind may perceive it to be, because it may not be that way. It may be much more strong for some to what it is for myself. But I wanted to share my experience and my understanding and my learning associated with how I've perceived those methods for connection to how it actually is. Because once I realized that, once I removed the, I guess, physical understanding or physical thought to how they would work, and got in touch with how it does work, it was much easier for me to make that connection and to start the process of reading. So I wanted to share that with you, because if you're somebody that's sort of going through the steps, going through the process of learning to connect, it was almost invaluable for me to realize that, and I thought it would be valuable to you too, toward making the process and that aspect of your learning a little bit easier. So I guess I'll do a quick little overview of what each of the clairs sort of are and how I use them. So clairvoyant is sight, not in the physical, but in the mind's eye. Clairaudience is sound in the inner ear, so sound that you hear inside. Clairsentience, which is a feeling without an outer touch or an outer stimulation. Clairagency is when you hold a physical item, either a personal belonging, a photograph, and you're able to understand and channel through that item and connect with the energy associated. Clairgustance, I hope that's how you say it, I'm so hopeless with these, to taste without anything in the mouth. So, as that is, you might be doing a reading and you suddenly taste pizza, and that person might have loved pizza. Clair empathy is to sense or feel another emotion that isn't of your own. And clair scent is to smell that's not within your surroundings. Same sort of thing with the pizza thing. And those are each of the clairs. There's also channeling and channel. That's similar. It's where you're open to receiving the messages and being the tool for receiving and explaining and delivering the messages that come through. So I guess once you do as I did and can disconnect from the ego's perception of how you would go about using each of these clairs to connect, it makes that process much easier. It still is a learning curve. You're still probably going to grapple with it. It will take time before you completely and utterly don't doubt. And I'm sorry, it's banging and crashing around here. We've got wind and a bit of a dust storm going on. It will take time, but once you are able to grasp each of those concepts in a non-physical form, it does make it easier. So going back to when before I was even aware of necessarily what was going on, I just knew that it was family that was around me before I had any, when I was younger, I did have spirit around, but I was too young to understand, too afraid, and I blocked it out. Then once my grandfather passed away, he would come to me in spirit. And again, my other grandfather, when he passed away, he would come to me in spirit. And it wasn't the same as when I was a child, where I learnt how to block it out. I still was able to some extent, but they just kept resurfacing, and it was almost like they were popping up to sort of say, like, this is something you can do. You need to look into this, if that makes sense. And how that would come about would be that feeling of somebody in your space, that feeling of being alone but being watched, not being alone. And that feeling would just sort of pop up, and then through my mind's eye, I would get a visual that that's who it was. So I would know that it was a relative. I knew that it was my family. I didn't understand it because I hadn't looked into any of it. I would then just sort of go, even though I knew that it was family and I knew that I wasn't in any form of danger, I still had that fear, and that comes with me. I'm a bit of a know-it-all. I'm a know-it-all. And in being a know-it-all, I sort of like to validate the fact that I'm a know-it-all, because I'm a researcher. If I don't understand something, I'll look it up. If I am talking to somebody, like, I'm quite opinionated. If I'm having a conversation with somebody and they sort of change my opinion because they've delivered some sort of information that I wasn't aware of, I'll straight away after the conversation go and validate it and look it up and see if it was accurate, so that my opinion of a particular whatever it is can stay where I know that when I'm discussing it with people, it's accurate basically. So that's a large part on why I sort of don't once I started looking into it, I was kind of like, why didn't I do this ages ago? Like when they were sort of popping back up again, because that's just the way I operate with every other aspect of my life. I look things up, I look into it. And I think that perhaps fear played a large role in that sort of fear of not knowing, but not enough to make me go, okay, I don't understand this, I'm going to look into it. It was more just like shut down, trying to block it out again, because that's what I'd done for so long. That was my norm. That was my way of dealing with it. That when it sort of popped up out of nowhere, I was just so focused on trying to do that, and they weren't letting me. They weren't going to play ball like that. They were like, there was a reason that they kept popping up, and there was a reason why it was only my family. It was because they wanted me to understand and pursue and look into this spiritual community, and understand a little bit more about mediumship and channeling and all the rest of it. So I'm very grateful that they did keep popping up and sort of not letting it go until I started to look into it. And I do feel that the lady at the house was a big part of that as well, because if it wasn't for, you know, her sort of showing up and really jolting me out of my comfort zone, because when it was my family that was around, I would just say, look, I know that it's you, just go away and leave me alone. They would respect that and they would go away and leave me alone. Whereas this lady it was almost like, well, I'm not doing that. I don't know who you are. I don't care how you feel. Not at all in a negative way. It was just the same as, like, you know, if your mum tells you to do something, you'll go and do it. If your sibling tells you to go and do something, you're like, you're not my mum. That's exactly how it was. So I'm grateful that happened, and that was my experience, because while I was uncomfortable in it, the uncomfortable aspect really forced me to look into it and do what they'd been trying to get me to do and what I would typically do and go and research it, but I wasn't. So this lady really did force me in a way to really open up and look and see and understand a little bit more. And without her, I would probably have not done that. I would have just kept telling them to go away, and they would have kept going away, and they would have kept popping back up, probably a little bit more frustrated with me each time. But yeah, I'm very grateful that was my experience. So I guess I'll leave it there. If this is your experience and you do have it, and just know, we can have a little bit more of a discussion about the lady in the house and that aspect of everything, and my family and that aspect of everything, in perhaps another podcast. But just know that so long as if this is happening to you, so long as you're in a positive place, do try to not let fear take over. And again, there are steps that you can take to control the energy that is within your home. But know, if you're feeling that there's somebody around that is of the spiritual world, if they're there and you're not afraid, they're not tampering with too much, they're just sort of around, just know that you're safe, and know that if you do say, leave me alone, they will leave you alone. If anything more serious is going on and you feel the opposite to that, definitely seek help. There are steps that can be taken to ensure that the energy is removed, smudging and the rest, and there is always people in your area that can help you with that. Reach out if you need advice or to be pointed in a particular direction, and I'm happy to help you with that. But for the most part, they're just curious, they're just around, and the spirit that was connected with the house, that happens, but it's not on the regular. It's usually how they'll come through is, if it's family, it's not always that it is locked into one particular location like the lady was with the house. She just loved that house and she didn't want to go anywhere. She was happy being there. And it wasn't at all a negative thing, as much as I was afraid of it because of my doubt and my fear of the unknown. That's all that it was. It wasn't at all a fear that was reciprocated because of anything that she was doing. It was just my lack of understanding. So with that, I'll leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed this second podcast. I'm not sure what our next topic will be, but it will be something. And thank you again for tuning in. I am available to answer any questions. Do reach out. And I thank you once again tuning into Spiritual Sharing with me, Spiritual Medium Shannon.